What have we been doing with noncompliance for a very long time? We have been extinguishing it through planned ignoring, through punishment. All we've really been doing is extinguishing frustration responses, but it's distracted us from what's really going on with this kid.
That's Ross Greene, the originator of collaborative and proactive solutions. When kids struggle with behavior, we often assume it's about motivation, compliance, or choice. But what if challenging behavior is better understood as a signal of unmet needs? How does that shift change the way we think about discipline, responsibility, and fairness? And exactly why do kids do well when they can? I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. A conversation with Dr. Ross Greene is ahead on episode 300.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Sometimes milestones sneak up on you. This is our 300th episode. And what really gets me is how different everything looks now compared to when we started. Back in 2018, this show wasn't even called the Neurodiversity Podcast yet. The language was still shifting. The conversation was still forming. My kids were 9, 7, and 2. And somehow, we're now 8 years into this, stepping into our 9th year and the first episode of 2026 together. It feels like a lot of life that's been lived between then and now. What has stayed consistent is the community that grew alongside the show. As the conversation around neurodiversity began to take shape, so did this space. Listeners, educators, clinicians, and parents, anyone willing to sit with complexity and keep learning as the science and the language and the lived experiences evolved. And that growth shows up in practical ways, too. For those of you who are clinicians, we have some great live continuing education trainings coming up, which are now approved for APA CEs, along with the NBCC CEs, which we already had. That's a newer step for us, and one that reflects how this work keeps moving forward. If you want to learn more about those trainings, you can find all of that at neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes. 300 episodes later, with 8 years of life layered into them, this podcast feels less like a project and more like a record of growth in our language, our understanding, and the way we show up for neurodivergent people. Okay, my conversation with Dr. Ross Greene is here next.
on a recent episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
All of that makes it hard to remember things, want to be out with people, do those self-care things like remembering to eat and sleeping well. And then when you have ADHD, that's also still remembering to do things, whatever way ADHD is impacting you and your executive functions. Not that they're the same, but in some ways they really hit you in similar ways. And when you mash them together, it's almost like exponentially or more, just dealing with all of it. And grief is very emotional, whether, again, it's from you finding out something that you feel like you should have known long ago or someone dying. Emotional regulation with many of us with ADHD can be hard to really control it and manage it. And so it can just crush together in like a tidal wave.
That's episode 289, Adult Diagnosed ADHD, Grieving What Might Have Been. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Ross Greene. Dr. Greene is a clinical child psychologist and the creator of the Collaborative and Proactive Solutions Model, or CPS, a framework that has fundamentally changed how many of us understand and respond to challenging behavior in kids. He's the New York Times bestselling author of The Explosive Child, Lost at School, Lost and Found, and Raising Human Beings, all grounded in the simple but powerful idea that kids do well when they can. This January, Dr. Greene is releasing his newest book, The Kids Who Aren't Okay, The Urgent Case for Reimagining Support, Belonging, and Hope in Schools, which is available for pre-order now. In it, he builds on his decades of work to explore how our schools and systems can more effectively support kids, especially those who are struggling most, through compassion, collaboration, and reimagined approaches to behavior and belonging. Dr. Greene, thanks so much for being here today.
My pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to do this.
I want to start off our conversation today by sharing a personal anecdote that was my first connection to your work. So I used to work as a school counselor. I'm an LPC now, but we had a clinical psychologist who would come to our schools and consult with us. And I think you know him, Dr. Jerry Cox.
Yeah.
Dr. Cox was the first person who suggested to me that we didn't have to use behavior charts in the classroom, like to manage quote unquote problem behaviors. And it kind of blew my mind because even though I knew that that was a practice that didn't ever really sit well with me, I didn't really realize that there was an alternative. So he introduced us to the ALSUP and to your work, which really changed the trajectory of how I support kids. And this was over 15 years ago. I'd love to start the conversation with just a little bit of background and foundation on your core approach and how that has evolved over time, just for anyone who isn't quite as familiar with your work.
Well, the name of the model is Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, or what I'll be referring to as CPS. It does represent a pretty dramatic shift for people who were trained the way I was. I was trained as a behaviorist, so I relied heavily on consequences, rewards, and punishments for modifying kids' behaviors. But in the CPS model, we're not even focused on the kids' behaviors, let alone modifying them. We're focused instead on the problems that are causing those behaviors and solving them. And although that came out of my mouth very easily, it's a very big shift. Because a lot of what people are trained to do, me included a very long time ago, is focus exclusively on a kid's concerning behavior, which I now view merely as a kid's frustration or distress response. And we were trained in these strategies for modifying those behaviors, behavior charts included. My mentality now is, what a shame that there's so many people who don't know that they have lots of other options outside of behavior charts. But when we're focused on behavior, that's all we're focused on is a kid's frustration response. But they're frustrated about something. And if all we're focusing on is their frustration response, we completely miss what it is that they're frustrated about. So what we've been doing for many years, decades, is modifying frustration responses concerning behaviors. I use those terms interchangeably. That means we've been late a lot because the concerning behavior, if it's a frustration response, the concerning behavior is late. It's downstream. Mm-hmm. Well, we don't want to be late. That's why crisis management strategies are so popular. Calming corners, giving kids a break, pinning kids to the ground in a restraint, throwing them into a seclusion room. And the neurodivergent community is among those that has most often been on the receiving end of those late crisis management interventions, consequences. And by the way, the neurodivergent community, to its credit, has been among the most outspoken about the harms of those interventions. But consequences, by definition, are late. Mm-hmm. It occurs after the fact. Well, that means we've been late a lot. That means we've been focused on the wrong thing. So a big part of the CPS model is focusing on the right thing, finally, the problems that are causing kids' concerning behavior. And the synonym for what we call unsolved problems is unmet expectations. Any expectation a kid is having difficulty reliably meeting is an unsolved problem. And that's what's setting in motion the kid's concerning behavior. If we focus on that instead, well, number one, consequences aren't problem-solving strategies. So we are now out of the consequence business. Consequences shouldn't be expected to solve problems. All consequences do well is modify behavior. But it means that we are now solidly in crisis prevention mode. A lot of people feel that finding yourself in the heat of the moment with a kid with concerning behaviors is a given. It's sort of the territory. It's not true. If we put some intentionality into being early instead of late, restraint, seclusion, corporal punishment, detention, suspension, expulsion, stickers, we're not in that business anymore. That's all stuff we do because we're already late.
It's reactive, and we need to do something ahead of time to set the stage. one of the core ideas of CPS also is this moving away from the idea that challenging behavior is willful noncompliance, and toward this understanding, as you mentioned, that it's a signal of lagging skills or unmet needs. And so when we hold that lens, it raises some interesting ethical questions, especially around fairness and harm and the power that adults have over kids. From your perspective and the way things that are quote unquote typically done, how should we reframe the way we think about discipline from an ethical perspective? And what does it ask adults to reconsider about how we respond to kids, not just in schools, but in families and society more broadly?
You know, what you're talking about here is all about lenses, the lenses we adults are wearing when we are dealing with a kid's concerning behavior. You could view a kid's concerning behavior as attention-seeking, manipulative, coercive, unmotivated, limit testing, etc. And that's going to lead you to interventions that are largely oriented around power. Mm-hmm. Here's an interesting statement. This is a statement that comes from the CPS model. Noncompliance is good. Noncompliance is good. It tells you that there's an expectation a kid is having difficulty meeting. And as I say to parents and educators and staff in treatment facilities all the time, you want to know that, right? Mm-hmm. You want to know that the kid is having difficulty meeting an expectation. What have we been doing with noncompliance for a very long time? We have been extinguishing it through planned ignoring, through punishment. All we've really been doing is extinguishing frustration responses, but it's distracted us from what's really going on with this kid. When it comes to being ethical, we need to stop extinguishing frustration responses. And, you know, it's fate that determines what a kid's frustration response is going to be. I slice the pie of frustration responses into two categories. They're fake, but lucky and unlucky. Lucky frustration responses, things like whining, pouting, sulking, withdrawing, crying. Why are those frustration responses lucky? Because they tend to elicit empathy, nurturance, support from caregivers. Unlucky frustration responses, screaming, swearing, hitting, spitting, kicking, biting, throwing, destroying, running. Why are those frustration responses unlucky? Because those tend not to elicit empathy, nurturance, and support. In fact, those frustration responses tend to elicit the most harsh, punitive discipline society has to offer. But as it relates to what the concerning behavior is communicating, doesn't matter whether it's lucky or unlucky, they're communicating the same thing. There's an expectation this kid is having difficulty reliably meeting. That is much more humane, much more compassionate, much more accurate. It's going to lead us in a completely different direction. I shudder to think of all the kids who have suffered under all of those punitive, exclusionary disciplinary practices when we could have done something different that would actually have been helpful. Mm-hmm. So the other thing I'll say about noncompliance is that it's also informative. If us adults take the time to figure out, in concert with the kid, what's making it hard for them to meet that expectation. We are now headed in a completely different direction. We and the kid are now problem-solving partners. We're teammates. This is not adversarial. This is not enemies. This is not about power. Much more ethical.
In all of this, the resistance, I think, sometimes to CPS comes from these deeply held beliefs about authority and control and compliance. And I see this play out all the time in real classrooms. Like, I was recently doing a presentation with some educators and doing a training, and one teacher kept coming back to this question about, okay, well, what happens when a student has had this problematic behavior multiple times? Like, they've done it and we've tried this and we've tried that and whatever. And clearly, I think what she was looking for was an answer that was like asking for a consequence, asking for a disciplinary response. Like, at what point do we stop trying these things and give a consequence? And I think she was frustrated that I wasn't giving her the answer that she wanted to hear. When you hear that kind of pushback, what do you think is really underneath that question for adults, and how do you respond to it?
Well, the first thing is that if the behavior is occurring over and over again, it means we probably haven't yet identified or solved the problem that's causing it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it tells us that that hasn't happened yet, right? When people say we've tried everything, I know, generally speaking, that they have not identified the kids' unsolved problems, and they have not solved those problems. And that a lot of what they've tried, almost everything they've tried, were them divining what was getting in the kid's way and them divining what the solution should be. There's somebody very important missing from that, the kid.
Mm-hmm.
This is collaborative. We need the kid. The kid is our number one source of information on what's making it hard for them to meet a particular expectation. But what you said the teacher said is what we often hear. They're still talking, sometimes not every teacher, that's for sure. We're still talking about the kids' concerning behavior. We're still stuck on frustration responses rather than using the available technology, collaborative and proactive solutions, to get out in front of the unsolved problems that are causing those behaviors, solve them proactively and collaboratively. Like I said earlier, being in the heat of the moment is definitely not a given. It's just that it's the setup. It's the way things have been set up. There's all kinds of policies and procedures that set us up to be late. It's also big money to be late. Schools spend a fortune on crisis management programs that do not have a snowball's chance of helping the people who are receiving that training get out in front of unsolved problems so they can solve them proactively so they don't have to be managing crises in the first place. That's what I say.
Yeah.
Now, do I empathize with that teacher? For sure. What do I generally speaking think is probably going on? Because this is what I always find is going on. They haven't heard about collaborative and proactive solutions yet. Good. That's an easy one.
One of the other interesting pieces I find is that schools are often using PBIS or MTSS models, and sometimes they are trying to layer CPS into those existing frameworks. When you see that happening, where do you often notice CPS being either misunderstood or oversimplified or unintentionally diluted? Like what is it that gets lost in translation? Or is there an effective way to do that helps teachers meet kids' needs?
You can solve problems collaboratively at any tier. On the surface, multi-tiered systems of support are not a problem. I mean, I have my own issues. I find that we end up talking more about tiers than we do about what a kid needs. We end up talking more about eligibility. That's a special ed issue than we do about what a kid actually needs. If you can solve problems collaboratively at any tier, then I'm not exactly sure what the meaning of tiers continues to be. The issue I have with PBIS, this is where life gets much more interesting. Another tiered approach is the B word, positive behavior interventions and supports. PBIS is focused on behaviors and modifying them. It's a offshoot of the applied behavior analytic tradition, and it hasn't left it that far behind. It is focused on behavior. We are checking in and checking out about behavior. We are teaching and reteaching replacement behaviors. No problem solving going on there. Now, can you implement problem solving within the 3 tiers of PBIS? Yes, but people are going to get confused because now they don't know if they're supposed to be focusing on the frustration response, the behavior, or the problem that caused it. Here's what I find. If we are focused on problems and solving them with kids, we don't need consequences anymore. This is crazy to people, right? People like me who were raised on consequences professionally, right? You really don't need tiers anymore either. Those are structures that I find aren't necessarily serving kids or educators very well anymore. What I've always said about tiers is that they tell you who's doing what. That's it. Tiers tell you who's doing what. I talk about this in a book that I have coming out in February called The Kids Who Aren't Okay. And chapter 6 of that book talks about how onerous a lot of our structures are in schools where we're trying to figure out what tier is this kid is at, what is the eligibility, what should this kid get, who's doing what. But boy, do we spend a lot of time figuring out who's doing what. I'd rather put all that time into what does this kid need. Then I find it's usually pretty self-evident who needs to do what. But often we're jumping into who's doing what before we actually know what the kid needs. As I say in the book, I think that's bass-ackwards. I think we can do better there too. So I personally don't find the tiers to be that useful, but even if somebody does find the tiers to be useful, you can be solving problems collaboratively and proactively at all three tiers. And the more CPS you're doing at tier 1, the less you're going to need tier 2 and 3, whatever those are.
I think one of the things that I see about PBIS that is so frustrating sometimes is that it is so focused on, like you mentioned, like what is observable? What are the things that we actually see as opposed to what's actually going on underneath the surface for any particular student? So many of the systems that we put in place, like PBIS, like behavior charts, they work, quote unquote, for the kids who don't need them. But the kids who need additional supports or other tools, other strategies, other ways to manage that frustration, those are not going to be the ways that you're going to actually accomplish the goal that you're setting out to do.
Now, here's what's interesting. Unsolved problems are observable too. So in the what's observable department, I don't like to make what's going on underneath sound too mystical. Unsolved problems are just as observable as the frustration responses that are being caused by those unsolved problems. So in the what's observable department, we're still good to go, right? In the department of what's making it hard for this kid to meet this expectation, there we do need information from the kid. But generally speaking, what the kid tells us is not particularly deep. People are always looking for sort of something earth-shattering about why the kid is having difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math. Generally speaking, it's not that earth-shattering. So people, generally speaking, don't have to be worried about what they're going to hear from the kid. It's just that what they're going to hear from the kid, what we might call what's going on underneath, but it's not that underneath because generally speaking, kids are delighted to tell you what's making it hard for them to meet a particular expectation. When do kids clam up? When we're trying to talk with them about their concerning behavior. Because trying to talk with a kid about their concerning behavior makes them think they're in trouble, become defensive, and stop talking. I find that when we switch and talk instead about things kids have been struggling with for a very long time. By the way, most of those unsolved problems are old. These are expectations. This kid's been having difficulty meeting for a very long time, right? I find that they sing. Now, while there's a downside to unsolved problems being old, the downside is the kid's been struggling for a very long time. There's also an upside. Those unsolved problems are very predictable because they're old. We can identify them proactively. We can solve them proactively. That's how we get in front of it.
I feel like often, especially in the neurodivergent community, we're often talking about accommodations. And there's always this pushback, like, well, what if we're enabling, not allowing kids to find ways to get through these particular struggles? How do you balance that approach as far as solving a problem? Because an accommodation can be a solution to a problem, but then also sometimes we're trying to also balance where is that progress or growth towards self-regulation. Like, how do you balance those two things that are not necessarily in conflict, but sometimes may appear as though they are?
My biggest issue with accommodations is that they're usually adult-driven.
Right.
We don't know what's getting in the kid's way yet. The definition of good teaching and good parenting and good treatment is meeting every kid where they're at. This answers the question, by the way. This kind of clears it up, right? Meeting every kid where they're at. There's developmental variability walking into every classroom, meaning every kid's different. Meeting every kid where they're at means we are being responsive to that developmental variability. I mean, if I was to really go overboard, I would say we really only need one psychiatric diagnosis: developmental variability. We all meet criteria for developmental variability, right? Kids with ADHD, are developmentally variable. Oppositionally defiant, you name it. I'm not going to go through the list. We're all developmentally variable. What I like about that is that it levels the playing field. We're all different. But it also accentuates the need to meet every kid where they're at. Now I'm not feeling bad about accommodations anymore. What I want to make sure that people are clear on often, though, is an accommodation is often not a solution. An accommodation is sort of varying the task, but often it's the same task, just a adapted or modified form of it. Often when I hear what an accommodation is, I find that it's actually not meeting a kid where they're at. Let me give you an example. This is a really basic example. But let's say a kid is having difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math, right? And let's say adults have divined, here we go again, that there's just too many items for the kid. And so that's divining what's getting in the kid's way. Let's say they divine that the accommodation or the adaptation is that they'll cut the number of items in half. All right. We haven't talked to the kid yet. We really don't know what's getting in the kid's way. And there's only one thing cutting the number of items in half we'll address. And that is if the kid tells us there's just too many. But if the kid tells us, I'm fine with single-digit division, I just can't do the double-digit. I don't understand how to carry this and that, right? Now that adaptation, now that accommodation makes no sense whatsoever. We did it with the best of intentions, but it was completely adult-driven. We didn't have a partner, therefore it was based on no information whatsoever from the kid. Count me out. I love the good intentions. I'd rather do this collaboratively than having adults divine. But if we're meeting every kid where they're at, if each kid is their own reference point, another way of saying that, then we can have high expectations for every kid, just with every kid as their own reference point. Now I'm not worried about accommodations anymore.
It's a shift, I think, for some folks, but it's so important to think about it as far as how we're supporting kids. Over the last decade or so, we've learned so much more also about executive functioning and emotional regulation and the role that the nervous system really plays in that behavior. I feel like, and this is my perception, but maybe you have a different idea of this, but when CPS was first introduced, I think a lot of that research either wasn't really as widely known or definitely hadn't filtered into everyday school practice quite as much as it has. I'm curious about how that growing body of knowledge has influenced the way that you think about lagging skills today. Like, are there things that you understand differently or language you use differently than when you first started talking about CPS?
Not that much. We don't call them lagging skills anymore. We just call them skills now. And that is out of respect for the neurodivergent community that contacted me and said, we don't like the word lagging. It has a neurotypical reference point.
That's a great point.
You know what? We don't feel like we're lagging anything. We're good with how we are. So the word lagging is out. It's actually now the instrument we use was called the assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems. Now it's the assessment of skills and unsolved problems. We still talk about skills or the lack of them as the reason a kid might have a maladaptive frustration response. We're still talking about unsolved problems the same way we always have. I would say that when I first came out with the model, there wasn't such a heavy emphasis on being proactive. Now, this model is all about being proactive. We do not want people finding themselves in the heat of the moment having to make a quick decision about how to proceed. We want to lay all that out for people and organize the effort before they get into the mix with the kid again, and hopefully in a way that doesn't cause them to get into the thick of it with the kid again. All that's about being proactive. Other than that, the model's the model.
It works.
The cool thing that's happened since the model came out in published form in '98 is that we've been applying it in prisons, countless schools, hundreds of thousands of families, inpatient psychiatry units, residential facilities. The results tend to be dramatic and speak for themselves. If I was a school trying to get rid of restraint and seclusion, this is where I'd head. If I was a school trying to stop using corporal punishment, which we still use in the United States, many people don't know this in our public schools in 17 different states, this is where I'd head. If I now know that all those detentions and suspensions and expulsions and sticker charts are not getting the job done and won't, this is where I'd head.
Which leads me to my next question. You're really kind of already addressing it, but I do want to dig in a little bit more. The phrase that I think everybody associates with your name is kids do well when they can, right? And I feel like that's something that really resonates so much for so many people. It's such a simple and powerful idea. But I do think that sometimes people panic and it gets harder to hold on to things when the stakes feel really high. So things like school refusal or just disengagement, as kids get older, some of those traditional milestones that maybe they're not meeting, that fear and urgency takes over pretty quickly. In those situations, what does it take to actually stay grounded in that principle? Like, how can people think about applying it when that pressure is on and they do want to revert back to that knee-jerk, we have to have a consequence, we have to, have some sort of solution here, like immediately that's going to, get a quick result?
A few things about that. I don't slice the pie of unsolved problems by the gravity of the unsolved problem. Because I'm going to be using the exact same 3-step problem solving, no matter what the unsolved problem. I find that if we're meeting kids where they're at, not where somebody else's kid is at, meeting every kid where they're at, we're not going to have a kid who's not showing up at school. Not showing up at school is a frustration response. It's a distress response. That kid's probably got a big pile of unsolved problems waiting for them to get there when they get to school, and they're not showing up. And that's just a frustration response, right? So it always comes down to, and yes, I would agree that having a kid not show up to school is not minor. I can't think of anything that is that minor. But I'm going to be using the same 3 steps, whether it's difficulty going to school or difficulty brushing teeth in the morning or difficulty in getting off the Xbox to come in for dinner or difficulty coming back into the classroom after recess. I don't slice the pie by gravity. Sometimes gravity is a factor when we're prioritizing, because if an unsolved problem is causing safety issues, it's going to be a high priority. I will slice the pie that way. Otherwise, we're going to go with frequency, the unsolved problems that are occurring the most, or gravity, the impact of the unsolved problem on this kid's life or the lives of others. But it's going to be the same problem-solving process no matter what. So my heart doesn't start beating faster when it's difficulty showing up for school than it does for difficulty brushing teeth before going to bed at night. My heart rate stays the same. I have 100% faith in the problem-solving process, and I'm extraordinarily optimistic that we're going to get this sorted out and get it done. And by the way, if the kid isn't showing up at school, that's an indication that it hasn't been done yet.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about schools. I want to touch just a little bit on parents and how parents can really embrace this concept of CPS, not just as a set of strategies, but also as a way of connecting with and understanding their child. How do you see parents who engage in the CPS process, how do you see it changing the parent? Like, in your experience, what shifts in the parent themselves as they move away from those power struggles and towards that collaboration?
First of all, recognizing that your kid's concerning behavior is a frustration response rather than attention-seeking, manipulative, coercive, unmotivated limit testing is massive. Recognizing that maladaptive frustration responses are due to skills the kid is struggling with, not motivation. Oh my goodness, we've just moved the earth, right? Because now all those motivational strategies we've been using, now it's crystal clear why they haven't worked, right? And people aren't looking for my help or seeking out the help of the resources we offer at Lives in the Balance because things are going really well. They're seeking out those resources because things are not going well. So it's good for parents to have lenses on, and that lens shift is extraordinarily powerful. I've had parents actually, and educators too, tear up when they learned that this was about skills, just like any other learning disability, not motivation. And that no matter how hard they push, pushing doesn't solve any problems either. So a lot of parents have put an enormous amount of energy into willing the child to do well. They're trying to help their child do well through sheer force of parental will. Sometimes when I'm helping people understand their kid, there's this exhale that occurs of them both recognizing why what they've been doing hasn't worked and also feeling somewhat unburdened. This is not all on me. This is a partnership. By virtue of how I've been trying to help my kid, I've made it adversarial. I've made it about me in terms of what's going to create the change. The change is about us. Me and my kid are going to work together now. This is not me like in, The Sound of Music doing the puppets from on high. This is me working with my kid, getting to know my kid, finding out what's hard for my kid. That is such a refreshing mentality for parents who have often a rather rigid concept of who their kid needs to be. The definition of good parenting is meeting your kid where they're at, too.
One of the things that I know has been on your mind lately, especially with the new book coming out and everything, is just that a lot of kids just aren't really doing very well right now across multiple settings and age groups. From your perspective, what's driving that trend? Like, what do you think it is that we're missing when we're trying to fix kids without addressing some of the broader conditions that they're growing up in?
Well, in the book, this is all chapter 1, I talk about all the things that have changed for kids over the last 2+ decades. We don't have time for me to go through all of them, but it's way harder to be a kid now.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to be a kid now, right? It's too much. But among the things that are in chapter 1 of the kids who aren't okay are things like school shootings. A lot of kids are very anxious about being shot at school. We don't pay heed to that, right? Mm-mm. In fact, there's a shooting, we get over it in 2 days. I'm not being crass here, but we light the candles, thoughts and prayers, and then we just wait for the next one to occur. Well, you know what? Kids don't move on that quickly, right? So if we're wondering why there are escalated rates of depression and anxiety in kids these days, higher than ever, there's one place to look, right? But us adults have often moved on. High-stakes testing, a horrendous idea straight out of the box. Telling every kid that they've got to go to the same bar by the end of the school year, telling every teacher that they've got to get every kid over the same bar by the end of the school year is not the definition of meeting every kid where they're at. And then one more that I'll mention, zero tolerance policies, which became popularized after Columbine and were an effort. This is a good example of for every problem, there is a solution. I forget what the phrase is that is either something like neat, easy, and wrong, right? This is where we tighten the vice grip even further to keep schools safer. Zero tolerance policies did not work. The data on that are crystal clear. In fact, they made things worse. And they made schools a far less hospitable, responsive place for kids and educators. And high-stakes testing did the same thing. So there's lots and lots of places to look. A lot of people point to social media as the cause, mostly because of a very popular book. And I'm not saying that social media isn't in the mix. What I am saying is that if all we're focused on is social media, if all we're doing is banning phones, we're going to miss everything else that has occurred over the last 2.5 decades that has been bad for kids. We don't want to miss everything else. Now, are those things we can do something about? Sometimes not. But what we can do, if we're an educator, we can create a school ecosystem, climate, culture, that is attuned to what's walking in the door. This is no longer business as usual. This is a new normal. If we're a parent, same deal. Some things you can do something about. Some things fall into what I would call the it is what it is category, IIWII. Good to know what we can do something about, good to know what we can't do something about, but most importantly, we have to be responsive to what's walking in the door. And there's a lot of kids who are more vulnerable now than there were back when I was growing up.
Ross, this has been such an amazing conversation. I'm so grateful for your time. As we wrap up today, I've just got one last question for you. So if you were talking to an educator or a parent who's new to this concept of CPS and they are struggling supporting the young people in their lives, what's the one thing that you would suggest to them? What's the starting point that you would want them to try?
You know, I'm not very book sale oriented, so this goes against my grain. But I would tell them to pick up a copy of either The Kids Who Aren't Okay, which comes out in February, or Lost at School. I love both books. If they don't want to spend money on a book, they should hop on the Lives in the Balance website, livesinthebalance.org, and explore all the free resources that are there waiting for them on that website. The one thing we got to do is start thinking outside the box, recognize that sticking with what we're doing now isn't working and isn't gonna. Let's be bold. Let's move on. Let's be early. Let's be collaborative. Let's meet kids where they're at.
Dr. Ross Greene, author of several books, including the forthcoming title, The Kids Who Aren't Okay, The Urgent Case for Reimagining Support, Belonging, and Hope in Schools. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. You've been a wonderful interviewer, and it's been enjoyable talking with you.
Reaching episode 300 feels like a reminder that none of this work is about finding the perfect strategy. What keeps standing out to me is how hard it actually is to stay curious when kids are struggling and the pressure is on. Urgency makes us want certainty, consequences, and quick answers. But Dr. Greene's model of CPS keeps inviting us back to curiosity instead. Not curiosity as a buzzword, but as a practice that asks us to tolerate discomfort, uncertainty, and not knowing the answer right away. And if there's one through line across these 300 conversations, it's that real change rarely starts with fixing kids. It starts with us being willing to pause and see things differently. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Happy New Year to everyone around the world. We're back on a steady schedule again, and I'd like to thank Ross Greene for being here today. I'm putting links to his work and information in the show notes so you can check it out, and I can't imagine a better way to start a new year of episodes than with Ross. Lots more great stuff to come as well this year. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.